here at Mizzou. Before we get started today for our main speaker, I'm just going to make an announcement that on Monday, March 21st, there is a talk by John Watts of Oxford, who is giving a talk on the Crown and the English Constitution. It is an unusual Monday evening event at 5 p.m. at the State Historical Society, so do come through, come check it out. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Ainsley LeSure, who is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Brown University. She's a political theorist, and her research is at the intersections of anti-racist critical theory, democratic theory, social justice, and feminist theory. Her talk today, Thoughts on the World, the Political, and the Black, is drawn from her current book project, Subverting the Rule of Race, Achieving Racial Equality Democratically. The project employs the thought of figures such as Hannah Arendt, Frantz Fanon, and Kwame Ture, and Charles B. Hamilton for two main purposes. First, the project takes up the questions about individual and collective responsibility for racism in the post-civil rights era. And second, it offers the theory of political resistance to racial domination that takes seriously the project of democratic racial equality. Part of this project has already been published as an article in the journal Political Theory, titled The White Mob, Inequality Before the Law and Racial Common Sense, a critical race reading of the Negro question in Reflections on Little Rock. As is our norm, Professor LeSure will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor LeSure.
Hello. Yes, I'm mic'd up and ready to go. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Jenny Akuda for inviting me to come here today. I would also like to thank Carolyn Spalding and Allison Smith for fielding so many of my inquiries and requests upon coming to visit. And finally, I want to thank you, the audience, for coming on this dreary Friday afternoon. And I look forward to thinking with you. So, for the talk, with the title, I promised that, oh, wait a minute, I want to keep track of my time. So, bear with me. I'm wasting time as I'm trying to keep track of my time. Okay, there we go. So with the talk, I promised thoughts on the world, the political, and the Black. And the political and Black are going to be emphasized today. I'm not really going to theorize the world so much here, but they'll come up, and if you have any questions later on about it, you can ask them, and I'd be happy to answer. But before launching into the nitty-gritty of the talk, let me give some background on how I got myself into this debate with some of the contemporary luminaries in Black studies. So the book I'm currently writing, the title has been revised, and it is still a working title, Locating Racism in a Shared World Toward an Anti-Racist Reality. And one of its central aims is to theorize racism from three angles in particular. One, as practices of racial inequality, which I get from Turing and Hamilton's Black Power. The other is through a paradigmatic depiction of an experience of being Black that we get in the in the fifth chapter of Black Skin, White Mask, which is written by Frantz Fanon. And the third is as understood through an analysis of the rise of white mobs and white lawlessness in response to formal attempts to extend racial equality to Black folk, which we get from Hannah Arendt's infamous essay, Reflections on Little Rock. So two of these central thinkers of the book, Frantz Fanon and Hannah Arendt, are theorists at the center of debates about the political and anti-Blackness in Black studies. Frantz Fanon in particular is at the center of a debate between Afro-pessimists, and Afro-pessimists, I do include Saidiya Hartman in this bunch, Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton, and there are a whole host of others, and Afro-optimist, singular, Fred Moten, about the status of Blackness in the world. So what emerges in these debates is a theory of the world and the race specificity of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. I'm going to come back to that. Whereas Arendt's distinction between the social and the political, and particularly her valorization of the political over the social, is turned on its head, especially by Hartman and Moten. And in short, they suggest that the social should be valorized over the political. At least that's my reading of what they're up to. And that the social is the pathway for a potentially better politics that is radically altered from the politics that the Western world founds and perpetuates. And of course, I'm going to need to unpack that too. So, but before doing that a little bit, let me sort of etch out the general landscape. So a key critique of politics emerging from these key thinkers in Black studies depends on understanding the place of the Black body or the Black being in ideations of the modern world. That is, the integrity of politics, the political subject, the human, and the intersubjective world that it produces is premised upon the constitutive exclusion of Blackness. This constitutive exclusion has had significant ramifications for Black being in the world. Transformed into objects of property due to the transatlantic slave trade, the ontological status which put the ontological status of Black people in perpetual question has persisted into the present moment. As such, and when I say the ontological status, the whole point, right, of slavery is that that the enslaved are objects of property, right, commodified objects, and the very social relations, market relations that are involved in making that a fact challenges the very integrity of the Black person's being, right? So that's what I mean when I talk about an ontological assault. As such, Afro-pessimist and Afro-optimist, and many in between is loosely related, have at best called into question and at worst completely refused the adequacy of political ideals like equality or the political designation of citizen as an adequate remedy for the ontological assault that Black people have suffered in the modern world. In fact, the ongoing suffering Black people experience due to unchecked terror unleashed at the macro level of the state and the micro level of mundane interactions with the non-Black point not just to the ineptness of politics to repair the ontological breach, but politics' active role in producing it. So on this view, politics becomes inimical to Black life and Black flourishing, and only something beyond the political holds the promise of bringing about Black liberation and Black freedom. Indeed, it is on the basis of this critique that Afro-pessimists deploy the discourse of world ruin and world building, a discourse that doesn't conceptualize the world politically, but socially first, and then some alternative thing we might want to call politics, but will be radically different than the thing that we know politics to be right now. As such, the political becomes a subsidiary of the social. And so that if the social is diseased, then the political is diseased, and if you want a better political, you've got to first start with the social. So let me give you an example of this critique by reconstructing Hartman's account of the failures of emancipation and thus Western politics to make the formerly enslaved free, and her alternative account of redress as a more adequate response to the harms of slavery. So in Scenes of Subjection, which was written in 1997, Hartman writes, quote, "Certainly manhood and whiteness were the undisclosed but always assumed norms of liberal equality," end quote. And it also followed that, quote, "Whiteness was a valuable and exclusive property essential to the integrity of the citizen subject and the exemplary self-possession of the liberal individual," end quote. She acknowledges that the emancipation of the enslaved, at least initially, threatened this racial calculus of citizenship, but this threat was undermined by the promulgation of the equality stipulated by the 14th Amendment in the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Explicit non-discrimination clauses were stricken from early versions of these pieces of legislation. And rather than understanding Black equality as requiring legislative interventions that would actualize equality, what Hartman would call redress, equality was taken to entitle the newly freed to equal protection. Now, equal protection amounted to holding out the possibility that freedmen had equivalent capacities to white men that would enable the freedmen to overcome their difference by seizing the opportunities afforded them by freedom, their natural liberty and sovereign individuality. This understanding of equality as equal protection did nothing to challenge racial sentiment, but allowed it to dictate the place of Black folk in the American polity. As a result, Reconstruction legislation was enforced in a way that, quote, turned a blind eye to distinctions of race and former conditions of servitude regarding certain rights, while permitting these distinctions as reasonable regarding others, end quote. Hartman embraces the wisdom of Tourget's arguments in Plessy that slavery established racial codification and discrimination along with the collective and personal control of the enslaved by the white master class. Permitting racial distinctions introduced a new social placeholder that reproduced the legal subjugation of Blacks. By defining slavery narrowly as simply chattelism, the court permitted regulatory racial classifications, a key aspect of slavery and a key instrument in subordination of Black folks. As such, the relations of mastery and subordination annulled by the 13th Amendment were resuscitated by judging the state's police powers exercised through anti-miscegenation laws, Jim Crow, and extra-legal social custom, as complying with the abstract principle of equality by designating interracial interactions outside the reach of the law, outside the realm of the political. The secession of the law of equality before white citizens' right to discriminate on the basis of race was legitimated on the grounds of natural social affinity, which were said to precede the law and were not susceptible to regulation by the law. So Hartman writes the following: if the criterion of Roberts and other pre-Civil War cases in the majority opinion of Plessy v. Ferguson attests to the longevity of antebellum attitudes towards Blacks and neglects the changes instituted by emancipation, it similarly confirms the impermanence or fragility of the law as compared with the durability of sentiment and the peculiar fashion in which the law established its autonomy. For Plessy, in acquiescing to the sway of sentiment, echoed Roberts, quote, prejudice, if it exists, is not created by the law and cannot be changed by the law, end quote, within this quote that I'm reading to you, I'm still reading the quote. Yet, if the law cannot change prejudice, is its role to affirm it? Following this logic to its end, it appeared that simple chattelism was only to be supplanted by legal subjection to the dominant race. That's the end of the quote. What is interesting about this passage is the way that Hartman compares the law to sentiment. In comparison, the law is impermanent and fragile, and sentiment is durable. Prejudice, a sentiment, is not created by the law and cannot be changed by the law, per Roberts. Even if this is so, Hartman wonders, should the law affirm sentiment? Hartman seems to conclude, throughout her analysis of the failure of emancipation, that the law can't help but affirm sentiment, because the law, despite its pretension of universality, can only be promulgated within the strictures of a particular social order. In an effort to de-romanticize emancipation, Hartman highlights the ambivalence surrounding the decision to make Black folk free. After all, the enslaved were given their freedom and the franchise as a result of military expediency. And questions about whether the newly freed's racial difference would ever make them fit for equality were at the forefront of congressional deliberation and the public sphere of post-bellum American polity. Hartman locates a post-bellum racial sentiment, the product of customs of white mastery and Black subjugation crafted on and off the plantation, circulating about Black difference, whether through outright endorsement or in the enterprise of casting doubt on its enduring truth that made it difficult for the newly free to exercise their, quote, belatedly conferred rights and guarantees of equal protection, end quote. So that the gap between the formal stipulation of rights and their legitimate exercise by the newly freed corresponded to another gap Hartman speaks of, the gap between abstract equality and extant social arrangements. With regards to these two gaps between equality on the one hand and the exercise of equality by the newly freed, formerly excluded, and belatedly incorporated, and the actual functioning of the social order on the other, Hartman puts forward the strong possibility that abstract equality merely, quote, dissimulates the stigmatic injuries constitutive of Blackness, rather than offering an actual remedy to them. So in summation, while emancipation may have ended chattel slavery, the racial customs that coordinated quotidian social interactions on and off the plantation were allowed to transform and proliferate into the police powers of the state post-emancipation. And after emancipation, the public good was aligned with white comfort, which was dictated by white racial sentiment or felt racial sense, defined by certainty about Black inferiority, indifference to Black suffering, and horror at interracial proximity, and actualized as the right to racial discrimination at the level of the state and civil society. Under these conditions, Black folks were unable to exercise the rights they supposedly possessed. Their needs were still unmet, their labor was still exploited, and the burdens of sovereign individuality were actually intensified. As a result, just as the enslaved were figured as will-less actants and sublime objects under conditions of chattel slavery, under conditions of emancipation, the afterlife of slavery, the freed are in a strikingly similar position. Okay, like this is the portrait that Hartman gives us. So instead of equality, Hartman floats the possibility that redress is the balm for, that's the phrase, the stigmatic injuries constitutive of Blackness as a result of slavery. Now, the contours of this stigmatic injury are illumined in Hartman's analysis of the bind of the slave and hence Black agency in general. Now, Hartman starts with the paradigmatic figure of the prostrate yet perky dancing Sambo. And part of the impact, so, and she sort of wants to look at these displays of Black frolic and fun, right? Because she's saying they play an instrumental role in the master being able to orchestrate and mandate these displays in order to stimulate Black will as a means to re-anchor it to their subordination, their own subordination. So they're through master-produced displays of pleasure and enjoyment, their will gets aligned with their own subjugation because they're having so much fun, they're having so much pleasure. Now, specifically, she suggests that by viewing the slave's pleasure through the prism of consent, the agency of the enslaved gets enlisted in the continuation of their own domination. But consent effectively usurps the pleasure, will, and agency of the slave because it misrepresents the actual ontological status of the enslaved. So only self-possessed subjects endowed with free will and inalienable attributes can consent. The enslaved are not this, but beings imprisoned by an abject and ambivalent personhood caught between object status and a paying subject constitution. The personhood of the enslaved, oh, sorry, I don't want to say that, that's my view. Anyway, the representation of the enslaved as what they are not only intensifies their domination, their subjection, because the ontological condition that plagues them cannot be addressed. Furthermore, politics, its ideals and categories, is unable to address the ontological crisis of Black folk because these supposedly universal principles, namely humanistic equality, are underwritten by racially exclusive norms that fuel the self-certain identity of original citizens and largely guide how the ideal of equality is applied to difference. And I basically outlined that at the first part of this discussion of Hartman. So that the law and politics proper, legislation, amendments, the public sphere and its rhetoric, civil society, all neutralize, perpetuate, and intensify the dilemma of being that slavery initiated for Black people. Alternatively, Hartman alludes to a different kind of politics, whose medium is a Black social that performs an empathic rather than an indifferent relation to the Black body that she thinks can better address the ontological crisis of the enslaved and the Black. And I'll say this too, as she's sort of telling the story about the failure of emancipation, she also wants to suggest that the racial codification, racial discrimination is being fueled by this indifference, this wide-scale indifference to Black suffering, okay? And during the antebellum period, the white master class aligns itself, is able, basically uses this suffering through a relationship of paternalism and sort of in a demonstration of care. So that's the difference, right? So when she's thinking about what it looks like to address the kind of problem that the slave is facing, she's thinking about how to counter the indifference of the post-emancipation period that she sees sort of fueling or playing a really important role in the continued subjugation of Black folks, right? Because they just kind of don't care about them. So she's suggesting that this Black social, by actually caring, by demonstrating care for the needs of each other, is going to be the balm that's needed in order to potentially challenge the bind that slavery has unleashed and continues and perpetuates. And the present possibility of this politics is implied in the genuine exercise of the slave's agency as displayed in the practice of stealing away. So stealing away on this account is when the enslaved would leave their plantations to seek the company of, to find their loved ones, to be with their loved ones, maybe at a different plantation nearby, or to find a lover, right, that they had in a different place. Like they were actually, not where they were supposed to be. And also kind of affirming these relations that slavery negated and said weren't important, right? And so she wants to say that if we can, just as the slave's agency is conscripted by misrepresenting it as a kind of consent to their subjugation, this agency also holds possibilities for the ameliorating of the stigmatic injury of slavery. So the kind of Black agency on display in Stealing Away, Hartman suggests, contains utopian and transformative impulses. It exploits the cleavages of the social order that links the antebellum and postbellum American polity. By granting property as social life and shared identification in the assertion of their needs and desires, and thereby politicizing these needs and desires. This public and collective organization of the enslaved, Hartman suggests, disrupts the boundaries between the public and private through the articulation of insurgent claims that made need the medium of politics. So the boundary between the public to need the medium of politics is a quote. I just want to say that. And the promise of this agency is contained, restricted, because there isn't a proper locus for it. And as a result, this agency doesn't enjoy the same kind of autonomy that the agency of the white political subject does. As such, this agency is short-lived, transient, and provisional, which means it doesn't stick and it isn't permanent. So despite these drawbacks, though, Hartman suggests that the slave's agency points to the need to this day to recognize the loss of the enslaved as an important move in redressing, quote, the violent discontinuities of history, the contradiction of captivity and enslavement, and the experience of loss and affiliation, end quote. She explains that this recognition, I don't want to read this anymore, this quote. So really in remembering the Black body as it was under the conditions of slavery, which she says persist into the present moment, that the violations visited onto the Black body by the West, which can't be undone, can be transformed into a salve, a means of healing and redressing the pained body. And though precisely because of the circumstances I mentioned before that the slave's agency doesn't have a proper locus, because politics proper is the thing that organizes our collective life, and there's no space for the kind of being that the slave is. And because it doesn't have a proper locus, it can't attain autonomy, and therefore is unable to establish itself permanently, that anyone who embraces their example in the contemporary project of redress must accept the perpetual incompleteness of the work. Because, as Hartman explains, a quote, of the constancy of assault and the inability to transform social relations through such practices would generate an event that would result in the reversal of forces. So like Hartman, Fred Moten, so I'm gonna move here to Fred Moten, wants to veil the generative possibilities that emerge from the Black's exclusion from subjectivity and humanity. Unlike Hartman though, Moten thinks that these possibilities can become permanent, that the being of the Black and its agency possesses world-making capacities. Unlocking it though requires refusing ontology, subjectivity, and politics, okay? So for Moten, Black people do not have ontology or a standpoint in the world, because standpoint and ontology are attributes of the Western political subject and the world erected in the subject's name. This lack of ontology, however, does not make the Black nothing. That's what Afro-pessimists would say. Only from the perspective of transcendental phenomenology does the Black excluded from subjectivity actually appear to be nothing. Because transcendental phenomenology can only acknowledge one kind of being, the subject, and restricts us to relations that only center the subject. Subject-subject relations or subject-object relations. And within that sort of emphasis, then of course, the slave is an object, not a subject. Because Blackness is the knowing subject's constitutive supplement, okay? So remember, part of the claim that these folks, this particular cadre of thinkers within Black studies are making is that the integrity of the subject, of the non-Black subject, requires the abject, subject, non-subject constitution of the Black, okay? So it's not like you're just excluded and, okay, we just have to be included. No. Your very integrity as a citizen and standing in the world requires to have this subject class, right? But Moten wants to suggest, though, that then that means that Black subjugation is needed. And to the extent that it's needed and desired, it also has power. So Blackness has an existence that and in that too, it also has an existence that supersedes the subject's perspective. So to gain access to these aspects of Blackness, Moten turns toward a phenomenology that centers the perspective of the thing, and hence opens up a space for thinking about the independent perspective of Blackness. Okay, so it's like Blackness as actually a thing and not as a subject, not as a human, right? That then we can start to think about a better order that would be aligned with Black liberation and Black flourishing. On Moten's view, Black being is only in crisis in its relation to the subject. In its relation to other Black beings, however, the crisis actually begets the subject and the world that supports its primacy. So in the universal machine, Moten etches out the significance of his alternative metaphysical theory of Blackness for the struggle for Black freedom by engaging the dispute between Hannah Arendt and Daniel Allen about the significance of Eckfurt's presence in Little Rock in the movement for desegregation. So Arendt doesn't acknowledge desegregation as political. At least this is the reading that everybody offers of Arendt. Whereas Allen understands desegregation as a politics of Black sacrifice that models the habits necessary for the reconstitution of the American polity to facilitate a whole and equal multiracial democracy. Now, Moten argues that though Arendt and Allen disagree about the political status of desegregation, they both remain wedded to the metaphysical foundation that undergirds the conceptual apparatus of politics. In claiming political status for Black folks, Allen presumes that Eckfurt's presence can be discerned within the terms and conceptual apparatus of an already given political order, namely an intentional political subject. Though Arendt's anti-Blackness causes her to miss completely the treasure Black studies and Black students offer toward anti-racist world-making, Arendt's fear of Black students indicates her awareness of the foundational threat Blackness poses to the political, a threat that Allen's story about Black redeemed sacrificing political subjects completely elides. Okay, I just realized maybe I need to give a little bit more background about Eckford. So does everybody know who Elizabeth Eckford is? Little Rock? Okay, so in 1957, is that when this happens? I think so. They tried to desegregate Little Rock, Central High in Little Rock, and that morning, actually, Elizabeth Eckford goes alone because she didn't get the call because they didn't have a phone, her family didn't have a phone, so she wasn't notified that they had decided not to go because there would be National Guardsmen there. So she went and she was accosted by a white mob, and she turned away and left. And got out safely, but she had she didn't speak for a long time. Like, she was terrorized by this white mob that was screaming at her and yelling at her, okay? So there's an entire, Arendt's infamous essay, Reflections on Little Rock, is a critique of the Supreme Court decision to desegregate the schools. And most of the times people read Arendt as saying that Black parents shouldn't have tried to get their students to go to this school because it really amounted to just social climbing, and that they weren't engaged in real politics. That's how people read her, what they read her to be saying. And then you have someone like Daniel Allen, a political theorist, classicist, right? Who wants to think about the instance of desegregation as actually an exemplar for the kind of habits we ought to model or have habits of sacrifice that we should have if we're going to realize this, new constitution we have in light of the mandate of segregation and because of the civil rights movement, okay? So Moten is coming in here and saying both of them are wrong because Allen wants to tell a story about Eckford that represents her as a political subject. And Moten is like, no, she's not, right? Like, this is the sort of, the stakes of the metaphysical claim that he wants to make. And so, I'm working through the way that he wants to relate himself to Daniel Allen and Arendt. I'm gonna bring in my reading of Arendt here a little bit and try to work through it. So I have a reading of Arendt's qualm about desegregation and reflections that I think reflects an understanding of the problem of anti-Black racism in the United States that is on par with with the way that Hartman understands the problem of racism, given what I sort of gave you, the rough and dirty picture I gave of you earlier in the talk. Now, the social in Little Rock, that's the essay, is associated with the threat of social climbing for the racially marginal within a racist polity. Arendt associated desegregation with social climbing. Now, social climbing need not be something that the racially marginalized identify with and set out to do, rather than engage in real political fights, right? So social climbing is a desire to improve one's social, material, economic station in life. And oftentimes when people think about the claim that Arendt makes about social climbing, they associate it with her distinction between the parvenu and the pariah. And so the pariah, the conscious pariah, is someone who chooses to align themselves with all oppressed, Jewish people and to fight politically for their rights. Whereas the parvenu is basically tries to align themselves with anti-Semitic society and just basically improve their individual lot. And people oftentimes take Arendt to be saying that we should be more like the conscious pariah and less like the parvenu. I think people are wrong about that, actually, right? I actually think that she's making a more structural claim about what it means to be in the position of a social climber, because of the racial dynamics, racial and economic dynamics that are happening around people in a racist polity. And so the racially marginal could be put in the position of a social climber, given the nature of the political decisions and wider social dynamics that are beyond any one individual's control. So the social climate is a structural position that one can be placed in. And Arendt suggests that Black children are placed in the position given the Supreme Court's decision. Furthermore, she suggests that the Supreme Court should not have struck down segregation with Brown because though it has the authority to do so, only because the South achieved segregation with Jim Crow laws, segregation is actually a custom all over the country. So to the extent that Brown reaches beyond law to custom, the situation arises where the law is at odds with a vast majority of whites' customs and desires with regard to interracial association, the same way that Hartman talks about racial sentiment. And one of the points that I think Arendt illustrates really well is that when the law is at odds with racial common sense is going to rule out, and it will become a competing rule over and against equality to orient interracial interactions, so that equality itself loses legitimacy. Like that's the sort of like problem space she's in. So given the way that she understands this problem, she's suggesting that if you want to challenge racism, you've got to defeat racial common sense. And politics is the only way to do this, okay? This little interlude is important because to think about how Moten figures, like what he thinks the significance of Eckford is here. So Moten contends instead that rather than view Eckford's appearance, or solo as he puts it, as an attempt to claim a true and rightful position within the political, Moten says that her appearance and its wordless aftermath reveals why the political is inimical to Black social life. Though it is as a radical, dislocated outsider that Eckford, the antithesis of the self-possessed individual, through consent not to be a single being, as a member of a great Black social ensemble, signifies the world constituting possibilities of Blackness, that is, as a metaphysically distinct being. That is, to apprehend the anti-political treasure Black study has to offer another world, requires acknowledging that effort is simply not a subject in this world, and her dislocation becomes verification of this phenomenological possibility. So when I told you that Eckford, when she faces the mob and turns away and she doesn't speak for a long time, Moten proposes that her inability to speak and her turning into herself might actually be evidence of what politics is for Black folks. Turning into the self, the loss of a capacity to speak, disassociation, right? And that like you can't sort of like, you have to contend with that phenomenal reality in order to deal with what it means to face the political. And that's why it should just be done away with. So rather than understand the planning and preparation of desegregation as an intention to become public, Moten invites his reader to see the placemaking possibilities of an altogether different metaphysics, anchored in a being who slips into oneself when confronted with the political, with the public and its world. Making public isn't a viable means to address the problem of Blackness, because the interplay between the world and the individual the public relies upon is impossible and illegitimate. So the presumption of a self-possessed, singular, distinct self-subject is what Moten calls into question. Specifically, he is calling to question the metaphysics that are thought by phenomenologists to ground identification. So Eckford's presence is indicative of the negation of self. Against the background of the condition in which the self is invented for its own protection, this negation of self and vulnerability that comes by it serves as a contesting armature for thinking about the political. So assuming a self places one in the bind of Blackness within a white world. And so if you want to sort of get out of it, then you kind of have to accept that you're not a self and think about politics, from that position. So I'll just say briefly, really briefly, what I kind of reworked all these sort of other thinkers' ideas here. And where I'm going with this is, I think that the problem with the way that Hartman and Moten think about the political is that the liberal political order is their notion of the political, right? It's a very circumscribed account of politics. And thinking along with Arendt here, I think she says that this politics can deliver anyone from oppression and domination because it relies upon a negative conception of liberty and not a positive conception, which involves people not being represented but being a participant in government. So freedom refuses, and freedom on her account refuses sovereignty, right? So already, I think a more Republican, more democratic account of politics that is not just thinking about constitutional limited government in a really restricted way is going to open up avenues for thinking about a politics that kind of addresses some of these binds that Moten and Hartman sort of outline for us. Now, Arendt suggests that one of the reasons, and I'm thinking about On Revolution here, the Arendt of On Revolution. Now, she says that the payoff for the individual in participating, being a participant in government, because one of her claims is that, you know, in the modern era, what happens is that people don't want to participate in politics in this like positive, robust way because they want to make money. They want to devote their lives to like, you know, their private social entity. So they see sort of the demands of political engagement as a burden, okay? And so she suggests that people who understand the importance of this positive understanding of politics, they understand and they enjoy it because of the opportunity it gives them for distinction and excellence. I suggest that we think about the payoff of a positive, you know, participant in government model of the public realm that we need to cultivate if we want to deal with some problem like racial common sense or racial sentiment, the way that it undermines law, shapes law. That the thing that the payoff has to be that in our relations to others, we can, that reality can struggle to take root and establish itself. That reality and the ways in which it can be grounded and it can sort of ground us in a shared common reality that begins to challenge the ways in which racial sense-making basically is singular and sort of like takes over, you know, in a racist polity when you even try to do this equality. Like if you want to undermine that, then you've got to create a more robust sense of reality that can contest the ways in which racial common sense, a kind of irreality, works to function and dominate the common world around us. And so this is how you begin to undo the mythology of Blackness. Rather than embracing the mythology of Blackness, which I think Moten and Hartman are doing, I think that we ought to really think about the Black body allowing its significance to take root in the struggle to have reality to emerge, and how, like, thinking about the Black body, its capacities for senses, which cannot be undone simply through mythology, even though the significance of, you know, the capacities of the Black body as a you know, robust sensorium, and that through that and the prizing and understanding of the stakes of reality is the way that we'll be able to think about politics in a way that can address some of these issues that Moten and Hartman are bringing up. So I think I've gone over just a bit, 41 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
I use as long as you want.
She
can go another 10 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll open up the floor for questions if people have any from the audience. Oh, yes.
I want to ask first question because I actually have to go. Thank you very much. I was wondering, I get the point about the about kind of incorporating the lived experiences and sort of the social enterprises within Black communities that have been struggling against oppression, right? I get that part of it, but I'm wondering how compatible that is to some of these, to a society, a Western society built on sort of constitutional democracy and the idea of private property and all of this stuff. Because some of these social enterprises, let's call them that, of that are expressions of Black agency, from slavery, post-slavery onward. A lot of them are also resuscitations or reimagining of African cultural practices, right? And how compatible are these with Western societies, to the point where we are going to propose that they be incorporated in a political space like this? Because I'm wondering if what you're proposing here is going to have to result in a sort of radical transition of this type of society in order to get to that place of incorporating these Black social experiences. That's my question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that question. So when I think about what you put before us, I automatically go to an important figure that I didn't really mention through the talk, and for my thinking, Frantz Fanon, who is really important for the way that I'm thinking about the body, the Black body, and what white supremacy, anti-Blackness, racial domination does to that Black body, and then how white supremacy, a sort of white dominated Western world, then persists, right? And part of the claim, like in the part of Black Skin, White Mask, chapter 5, where he's basically telling us how, like what it takes to smoke a cigarette. I lean back into my chair to reach for the cigarette, and I take out the, pull from the drawer, whatever. And then he says something to the effect of, by being able to do those movements, he is communicating, his body is communicating with the world. It like sets up this dialogue with the world, right? And then he immediately moves from that discussion to talk about the racial epidermal schema. And then I think, then he gives us the famous scene in the train where he's like, I see myself in triple and whatever. And I'm like, that's a hallucination, right? And what's happening in that discussion is that Fanon is saying, something as simple as going to smoke a cigarette should have worldly significance. It should impact what the world means for everyone. But when I move in the world, I'm not just simply taken based upon, what I'm doing. This racial epidermal schema gets placed upon me, and there are these racialized meanings that get put upon me, even by a little boy. And those racial meanings actually disrupt my dialogue with the world as a Black being, right? Like he can be a being, but he can't be a Black being and have that kind of dialogue with the world. And that's what sustains white supremacy, right? And so like one of the things that I'm really thinking about here is how his account of the world, not just like what, each individual does, but the significance of individual action for the world we share in common. That's the thing that we need to recuperate, or that we need to make more open to Black being in the world. And the way that you have to do that is kind of like ground up, because the way that the white world is sustained is a ground up operation, right? That part of the power of the West and whiteness is that it has happened over time across space, right? And that what it looks like to undo that kind of thing is that same kind of, time and across space iterative interaction. Now, it also is a very fragile enterprise, right? Because violence can disrupt it. Like there's power inequity, there's all these, other things. But I think that the work of that kind of like world making and world building is about holding people accountable to the significance of their actions in these on the ground iterative interactions that we have with each other around race. Because it's only through that kind of like ground level work, having the, conflicts, like holding people accountable for their so-called, commitment to equality, really doing the dogged work of asking ourselves what it looks like to actually actualize it on the ground, to think about power relations, et cetera, is the only way that that kind of thing is going to happen, right? But yes, it's like it's sort of like this really fragile on the ground work of explaining how the significance of Black action gets undermined, the ways in which white supremacist practices of meaning making are authorized over and over and over again, and contesting it on a daily basis in community with others. And then that's sort of like the importance of then, I think, reclaiming politics, because politics is not just a liberal political order. Like, I think that it's an art, a technology we have around thinking about how we actually live together and intentionally build community that's not premised upon sameness. Because domination does that kind of community building premised upon sameness, and it's violent, and it, is really forceful or whatever. So that's kind of my off-the-cuff response to you. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Ferris.
So, thanks for the talk. I really liked it. I have sort of a question about the sort of status of politics for both Hartman and Houghton. So, I'm 100% convinced that they both have this kind of overly circumscribed idea of politics, right? But so I wonder, I guess my question for you is the problem with Houghton and Hartman that they are offering something because of the circumscribed view of politics that they have? They're offering something that's opposed to politics, or are they instead offering something that is closer to politics and they just don't understand such politics in the more Arendtian sense that he encouraged them? Is there like a strand of something that you could sort of show to do this? It is politics, you just got it.
I actually think that that their view of politics is problematic, because it's a view of politics that is driven by the social, which is the thing that it shouldn't be driven by, right? So, like for Hartman, I mean, that's kind of like the lesson of the critique about emancipation, that it fails because the social overpowers the political, right? Like you can't have like this idea that there's a universal ideal of equality that can be refashioned to include greater amounts of people. She's like, that's not true. This norm of whiteness circumscribes these principles. There's no difference between the universal ideal of equality and its promulgation, right? Like that, I think that that's her view. And I want to resist that. I want to push against that idea. But how do you begin to do that when there's this account, on what grounds? Like, I don't want to just simply affirm the ideal of equality, right? Like, as political theorists would do, right? But I want to deal with why she thinks that's the case. And it's because of this story around how racial sentiment undermines these principles, and then her suggesting that the way you produce communities that are empathetic towards Black being is to sort of foster, the administering to each other's needs, right? Which, as an Arendtian, a good Arendtian, I find myself compelled by her thinking, right? Is that really how, do we want a politics that really thinks about the thing that we share in common with each other? Just is the kinds of our interests, just the bare things that we need, that's the basis upon which we should think about the political? Or should we be thinking about the political above sort of like our sameness and the, you know, sort of these really bare things that we hold in common and dare to constitute a shared world that we have in common with each other by feature of being in the same world together, right? To sort of push against that impulse to just think about difference or sameness as the thing that's going to solve the problem that we're confronted with because of how people relate to difference. I mean, that's how I would respond to that. Thank you.
So we have some online questions whenever you're ready.
I think I saw Jay's
Yeah.
hand in the back. Jay.
Thank you for that. I mean, I've learned an awful lot. And it's quite interesting to see how some of the thinkers you're looking at prioritize or have a certain understanding of politics, and others are looking at social factors. I guess the obvious thing to ask is that the one that wasn't in there among your thinkers was sort of economic interpretations, material interpretations of racial inequality and the social problems there. I mean, the idea of the problem of emancipation in the American context is that the problems of 48 people wasn't upheld, that the Black freedom struggle was fundamentally hard about aggregating material power. You don't have successes. You have a strong Black middle class in the mid-20th century. That's sort of old. I guess a very old-fashioned line here. But I'm just wondering how the material and the economic world plays out into these competing understandings of political action and social change that we're discussing.
Well, I mean, from the perspective, I think of Hartman and Moten. Yeah, do I want to say both of them? Yeah, maybe. I think that they would say, like, why weren't these promises upheld? You know, like, part of I think it still comes back down to sort of like the rhetorics of equality, right? Because part of the promise of 40 acres in a mule, part of this sort of like idea that Black people would become assimilated within the American polity hung around this question of whether they were actually equal or not, which then also came down to the way that they were thought about as racially different, right? So it's like this is something Hartman grapples with a lot, like the degraded position of the newly freed. The question was, were they like this because of slavery, or are they naturally inferior, right? Like that, both of those things together, and then even crafting the pathway into equality with that question open and sort of requiring that the freedmen demonstrate their fitness for equality in order to say that they were equal, and then not being fit, not being a reflection on the condition of slavery that they had come from, but affirmation that they were not actually free. So it's like that, it does come down to like this racialization, racial codification, racial discrimination, and the ambivalencies that are around the status of equality that the so-called principle of equality or equal standing is supposed to afford them. So yeah, I think that there's a way in which that story about the failures, like why Black folk never got 40 acres and a mule and whatever, also comes down to this story about the way that race gets refashioned into the law post-emancipation, even though you have these amendments that are supposed to sort of grant them equal standing as citizens.
So here's one that comes from, and I love to do these in bit by bit because I should have brought my laptop in to get these. There'll be online questions, but someone's texting me from the back. So.
Oh, nice.
So this comes from our history colleague Merve Fejela, who studies at African intellectual history, I think you would say. So she asks, can you elaborate on why you think positive liberty offers a way for recovering the political? As another liberal account of freedom, isn't it also laden with Hartman's, quote, burdened individuality? So I think Merve's read the same, must be reading the same stuff. So, and I think she's out of town. So.
Okay. I don't think, I'm trying to think here, positive freedom laden with burdened individuality. I think, so, okay, caveat, the positive freedom part is where I'm going with this chapter. Like I'm actively trying to reorient myself within the claims that Arendt is making about the different revolutions or whatever, in service of thinking about this social and political distinction that is arising in this literature in Moten and Hartman. Burdened individuality to me is about the ways in which the sovereign individual, like the sort of this notion of the sovereign individuals and the capacities that the individual is supposed to have, like the opportunity, like the opportunities that equal opportunity affords, you know, a sovereign individual who can basically make a living themselves, like, you know, has this agency or whatever. I don't think that that's what I mean when I'm talking about being a participant in government. Because really what I'm interested in is the collective work that is required to establish a shared sense of the world we have in common. That is an alternative to the sense of the world we have in common that is largely the result of the common sense that domination makes, that racial domination makes, right? So from the position of someone who's concerned about the problem of racism, which I understand is a problem of racial common sense, which for me is embedded in the ways in which you know, the racial knowledge that we deploy in our interactions with others, that if we're going to alter and change that, then we have to think about, you know, the construction of our communities, the construction of shared knowledge in a more robust, activist kind of way, right? And I mean, that's the thing that's kind of vague for me at the moment. Like, what exactly do I mean by that? You know, I'm thinking a lot about deliberation. I'm thinking a lot about what's happening in the workplace. I'm thinking about sort of like these, like the same way that the story that Hartman wants to tell about the quotidian, you know, racial interactions that people have that are producing, that are resubjugating Black folks in the post-emancipation period. I want to think about the possibilities of those interactions to undo that kind of thing and what that work looks like. So that's how I will respond to that. But there, I mean, there's lots of things to work through here, right? Like, so like to respond, it's like, for instance, like that whole bit when I was like, rather than thinking about the pleasures of being a participant in government in terms of like excellence and distinction, right? Which Arendt, like, you know, geeks over, which is just like, really, is that really why people want to be, you know, in the public sphere? Like, thinking about the stakes of it as the grounding of reality. And for me, like thinking about reality as something we constitute in relation to each other that does not violate, that doesn't violate the significance of the action of the racially marginal in determining what we have shared in common. Like that then becomes the stakes of showing up and being an active participant in, you know, our politically significant interactions. Maybe that's how I'll put it. Like, and that's kind of what I'm thinking about in some ways when I say being a participant in government. I would really love it if she were here so she could tell me.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Merve, if you're watching, just give me a call. That's like, we'll put you on the phone. That would be great. Go ahead, Justin.
Great talk. I had to think harder in that talk than I have in a while on our Friday afternoons. So it was challenging to me.
Good
And
thing we didn't get the beer didn't come first.
I know, we do need a beer, it'll get easier during the conference. You were just talking about the political construction of reality, or the construction of reality through our interactions with each other.
Yeah.
And we were talking at lunch today a bit about ontology, and so I want to ask again about that in thinking through this, and just get your thoughts on what the limits are to what we can construct with respect to reality through our interactions with each other, and whether part of the critique is that there are built-in limits to what we can do, so that the attempt to treat someone as property fails precisely because there's something about them that makes it a category error, that they're ontologically not actually property. And so we can't, even through our political construction of reality, make that a reality. And I was thinking about, this would be a different approach, but just to get your thoughts on even what's going on in this dissenting opinion in the Dred Scott case. So the question is whether or not there's a property right that would allow Dred Scott to be taken into the federal territories. And John McClain, in his dissenting opinion, writes that a majority of the court has said that he's property to be taken into the territories. He disagrees with that. And then the reason, he says, is because he's not mere chattel. He bears the impress of his maker. He is amenable to the laws of God and man, and he's destined to an endless existence. So it seems like he's trying to say that no matter what the political construction of reality is in that instance, or even the legal construction of reality, there's some deeper reality that pushes back against that, and that makes it a category error to say that he's mere chattel. And the category error, as he kind of goes forward, seems to be one related to this idea, this long-standing biblical idea of the image of God in man. And then you'd have to ask the question, what does that mean? But to bear the impress of your maker, to be amenable to the laws of God and man, seem to suggest something like your ability to give and comprehend reasons for action and to deliberate about justice. And then something else that seems like an enduring reality beyond the body, the kind of pattern of life that distinguishes between a cadaver and a living individual. So there's a lot there. This is why I was thinking hard as you were talking, but I'm kind of curious to just understand better what you mean by the ontology piece and the political construction of reality piece, and how that interacts with the tradition that goes before it.
Excellent question. So let me see how I might. So one of the things I thought when you started your question, that casting the enslaved as property failed. I was like, did it? Right? I mean, like that's the question. Like, did it? They were sold. They were held in ships. They were treated like cargo. They, like the way that the law could related to them and constructed the kinds of liberties that were allowed to happen in relationship to them, right? The enslaved. They were treated as if they were property in some sense, right? So there's a way in which, so part of, I'm like, did it fail? So in some ways, it didn't fail, but in other ways, I think it did fail, right? And so it's like trying to get at, like, why I am invested in thinking about it as a mythology that one should refuse because it does actually misrepresent reality. At the same time that we can acknowledge, like, I think these folks are really right in insisting that this irreality takes on the value of reality. That's kind of like how I want to talk about it, right? And I'm getting this language through an engagement by thinking critically about what Fanon is up to in chapter 5 of Black Skin, White Mask, and the critical engagement that he stages between himself and Merleau-Ponty, right? This instance where he's thinking about his being Black, and one of the things that, like, what it looks like to be Black, right? So that he can face this little white boy who's like, look, a Negro, and start to trip out, right? Like have the burden of the white gaze upon him. And like before he I think, hallucinates in that scene. He he prefaces it by telling us, you know what? Me and my friends know that Black folk are equal. Like, we know we're equal, whatever. But yet, when he is faced with this little boy, he hallucinates. What is going on, right? And so I think that Fanon is what I recover from this critical engagement with Merleau-Ponty. So I want to think about the world as being dual layered, as having a cultural layer and having a natural layer, right? And the natural layer is what is produced in our relationship. I mean, a lot of Merleau-Pontian scholars are probably turning over in their grave. There's lots of people who would be like, no, the flesh. I know this, but I'm thinking about the phenomenology of perception and this particular critical engagement caveat. All right. So the natural world is what we get in relationship to objects, right? I think that's the significance of the part of the scene where Fanon is reaching for the cigarette, and we're talking about the significance of his body being able to orient properly in space. The fact that I can walk is already disclosing to you all the knowledge that I have about the world, right? The way that I even comport myself, the fact that I can make distinctions in the faces here. My perceptual capacities connotes a kind of shared knowledge that we all have. If I pointed at that chair and I was like, oh, that's a beautiful red chair, people are like, what's going on, right? Because we share a world, right? And if I did say a red chair and you knew that I had sort of psychological events, whatever, you could maybe be able to explain it, or maybe I'm colorblind, all those other things. We can begin to explain something that may be off, that doesn't sort of represent, the facts in the world that we all see and share in common, right? And so that's I want to talk about that as the natural world. And the recognition of human beings, other people like ourselves, right? So this is the human element part, right? How do you know I'm a being like you? And there's a two-part process, because when my relationship to myself, I'm, patently aware of all of my interiority, all the thoughts I have, whatever. I'm a particular kind of being to myself. You are not the same, to me, but I can recognize you as a being who might be like me. How does that happen? And the way that on this Merleau-Pontian account, the way that I even begin to see you as a person like me is I have to encounter you as an object first. And then I see you as a person that's like me. That's more than an object, that's a subject, that's a human being like me. And I want to suggest that it is that quality of humanity that lends itself to the kind of violation that the enslaved, sort of suffer. So that the enslaved actually is a better exemplar of what it means to be human than the so-called sovereign individual, right? That basically is able to contain itself from the kind of vulnerability of your relation with others through the building up of a cultural world that relates to other human beings as if they're not subjects, right? And it's that kind of cultural practice, the norms, the habits that's built across time and space that literally produces a world coordinated with people who do the same kinds of things that produce the irreality that a human being is not, a human being, the significance that comes along with that kind of thinking, right? So that's how I'm thinking about, that's the backstory and how I'm thinking about reality and how I want to sort of evoke it for, and then in that regard, right? What it looks like to establish reality and protect it is being able to find those places where the irreality that takes on the value of reality is exposed as not being real and helping us sort of establish what is real. And it's an iterative, it's a very vulnerable thing. It's not objective reality, something that just stands outside because we know certain truths, right? But it's this collaborative project of us all bearing witness and being a part of the meaning-making apparatus so that we have a world that really reflects all of our beings in creating the thing that we share in common. So that's kind of like how I'm thinking about it.
You want to do one more question from online?
Yes, let's do it.
That's great. It's like, it's probably sort of it's like a radical shift toward a more quotidian kind of question, which is like from Jacob Leverson. And I'm going to read it straight, and then I think I have how should politicians address society's indifference toward modern racism, perpetuating social and economic equality that disproportionately affects people based on race? But I guess, I think,
Can you say it again?
I mean, well, but I was also going to say, I think what he's asking is, what can what can politicians, you know, basically, what can people in politics do to make this the co-reality that you're talking about? It's a practical steps type question.
Okay. First of all, I would say that, I don't know, what do I want to say? This is going to be weird. I think the way, like, when we think about politics, so this is the positive liberty piece, right? It makes me a good Republican. Not that kind of Republican. Republican is in, I mean, and it's fine.
Not a mark.
I don't want to get into that. But we're like Republicanism. That really, the moment we start to think about politics as happening in elite levels with representatives, and that we only think about voting as our participation, and it becomes about policy making or whatever, that we're already not in the right register. We're already not thinking about politics at the appropriate scale to deal with the kind of problem that we are facing when it comes to race and racism. So that's like one thing, and not to say, I mean, and there are things that these elite, like I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have representative democracy. It's just that I think that it needs to be supplemented. So like a rent, you know, sort of township, like really weird pie in the sky township alternative that she offers in On a Revolution has always appealed to me. And I'm like, well, what does it look like to realize that kind of, you know, thing, to think about what she calls the spirit of revolution that gets lost when there's too much emphasis placed upon the Constitution as this, you know, document that protects people from the abuses of power, rather than as an instrument that actually constitutes power. Now, her whole account of like the ingeniousness of the founders and constituting power and thinking about states just rings different when we think about the kind of problems we're facing with regards to race. Especially, you know, thinking about like what I just told you about the police powers that gets sort of resuscitates the powers of the master class by giving the states this power to basically circumvent the federal mandate for equality by allowing discrimination, right? So, you know, but I do think that there's something about thinking about power. Who has symbolic power? Who's able to affect? Who can say what in a space? How, in fact, we police certain language, certain insights about things? Who gets a say-so? Who doesn't get a say-so? Like, those are the kind, like, that's, I mean, I think the scale of government and the way we think about politics needs to come down. But I also think that once we start moving down, like when we think about the scale of our relations on the day-to-day, we always think about it socially or like on an intimate, in an intimate way, right? How can we think about those relationships in a way that acknowledges their political significance as distinct from the ways that we relate, you know, kind of just socially or intimately or whatever, right? I think that that's part of the trick. Like, what's the political significance of our day-to-day interactions? And what forms of, you know, governance might we need to think about instituting and practicing on a regular basis to cultivate, and here I'm thinking about Alan, cultivate the right kinds of dispositions to each other and who we are and the significance of our being. I mean, that's where I am right now and thinking about it. But yes, thank you for these amazing questions. It's all like, thank you so much for inviting me again. It's always a pleasure to have to to be able to think with people, to have questions put to you on the spot and then have to think with you on the spot. And it just always helps me get clear about what I think and just sort of like go on the ledge and just say things, you know. And you know, thinking is in action and in motion, and I think that it's important to see that and to honor that and to appreciate those who show up and allow us to do these kinds of things as scholars. It's like the best part of my job too. So thank you so much.
Good ending, I think we have a reception.
Thank you.